This is Alex Mikulchuk, and this is my video essay on should 23andMe be used to identify race for the Biology 557 course. Um, and so for the primary points that we're supposed to touch on, is genetic testing to determine race a valid use of the tool? Um, you know, I I think everybody has a right to sort of use the tool for whatever they want to. So in that sense, I think it's valid, and I definitely understand why it's tempting to use it in that way. I think especially in a country like America, where there's a really large population of people that don't really have a way of knowing exactly their background or their lineage, feeling like they're like detached from some distant ancestry that they never really had the opportunity to connect with or even fully know about or understand. It seems like this would be the perfect thing to fill in as a solution. Something to help uh, people like that. And although I do understand, the justification for wanting it to work, I think that the results given are sort of misleading, difficult to put into context, um, since I'm pretty sure that basically all of these companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, I think, they use mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is only passed down through the maternal line, unless I'm getting that mixed up, meaning that there's a pretty large segment of basically your ancestry that's being missed out. I believe, if I'm correct, um, that it basically boils down to only being able to really define where any two individuals from any generation of your ancestry are from. Um, so meaning if you go back enough generations where you're talking about having, 64 great, 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 whatever grandparents, and you can only identify where two of those individuals are actually from, um, does that really tell you much about your ancestry at all? I don't really think so. And in that sense, um, I don't really think that genetic testing like that is really useful. I also think it's kind of an interesting point that what we mean by when we say genetic testing is specifically that there's otherwise no like accepted gene test where you could identify somebody based exclusively on genes, um, as a certain race, which I think is kind of telling in this context too, that maybe it's not something that we really should be trying to define and test from the standpoint of strict genetics. Are racial categories natural, meaning there are a collection of features allowing you to identify a race, or are the designations arbitrary? Um, I don't know if maybe I'm misunderstanding the terms somewhat, but I do think that it can be both. I don't think that those are mutually exclusive. I do think that, generally racialized groups, which I think was a good way to refer to it in the reading that we had, um, usually some set of features is present, that is used in a political way, in a social way, basically to identify, ostracize, differentiate that group. It's sometimes overtly used in terms of justifying certain treatment and things like that. Um, so although there might be a collection of natural features, I do think that those designations are arbitrary in the sense that even if that feature was changed, even if all of the features associated with that racialized group were changed to something completely different, um, something else would be found in that case. Usually there's a social, political, cultural context here that plays a main role, I think, that really takes primacy over um, any actual set of physical features that anybody might have. So yeah, I do think that those designations are arbitrary in that sense, that they're fully interchangeable, but I do think that it's usually based on natural features, even though there are obviously plenty of cases where it's kind of debatable in the cases of certain mixing or mixes of a bunch of different races in one person. It could be, I guess, debatable, how you'd identify that. What is the difference between using a genetic tool to determine race versus a predisposition towards a particular cancer or depression? Well, I think pretty obviously here, determining a predisposition towards a disease is a medical question. It's a question about personal health. Uh, you know, I not that I want to trivialize how important it could be to an individual to gain some information um, on their race, their background, their ancestry. But what I do want to say is that's kind of a personal desire. That's something that's like emotionally fulfilling, potentially psychologically beneficial, but not really directly related towards impacting the physical health of someone. Um, and I think that I would say that that's really the main difference, really just the purpose of it. And I think that that's why the two should definitely be, treated differently. Um, what is the correlation, if any, between race and accepted biological groups like species, genus, family? Um, like that it says it's acceptable to say there's no correlation because I don't think that there's a correlation, and I think that that largely makes sense. Humans as a species, I mean, we're pretty unique in a lot of ways, but a big one, I think, is definitely the fact that there is so much continued interaction, communication, genetic exchange between groups of people, the same species, essentially all over every inch of the globe, almost. Um, I think that it's difficult for me to name a single species that's really able to do that. I mean, there are some species that travel great distances, like I think pods of orcas can travel, between oceans across continents. But even those groups are usually differentiated into subgroups um, that are a little bit more distinct, I would say, than race generally is. Although maybe that's a better comparison for race, but I don't even think that that generally has a specific term. I don't know if there is a specific term designating those different pods of orcas of the same species, but that still have um, notable, consistent differences in behavior, in environmental niche, in preferred diet, in size, and other physical characteristics. Even in sort of the language that they speak in. The sounds that they use to communicate can differ from region to region. Um, but I really do think that there's a very short list of animals that are able to have such a widespread and still not basically split off into different species and different groups. I think it's kind of logical that we wouldn't really have a very good descriptor that matches one to one with that. I think everybody would agree that it's probably a bad idea to consider race as a similar category to species. Um, and that that also gets confusing with some colloquial uses of in terms like the human race and all that. Um, so yeah, I just think it's race in general, not a very scientific term, mostly a cultural, political, social term, um, and that it really doesn't correlate to anything that most species really have present.